There's nothing worse than a Tibetan pit latrine. I will go to my grave thinking that. And you know what? Larry, the Singaporean, whose parents are Chinese, and he'd driven through Tibet twice before, and he said to me, "He's like, when you're here, you'll be asking, why did I come? It is real hardship. You're freezing cold, you can't breathe, long days of driving." He says, "But I guarantee you, in a year or so's time, you sat at home thinking, when can I go back?" And I did not believe him at the time. But watching the footage when we were editing the series, it is just stupendous. And the Tibetan Plateau is, it's one of the most curious and brilliant sort of, biospheres on Earth.
Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I am your host, Byron Pace. This is episode 214, and this is a Modern Huntsman production. In this week's episode, we have somebody who embodies the title of this podcast, Into the Wilderness, Alex Bescoby. He is the man behind a recent overland adventure from Singapore back to the UK, which replicates a historic overland expedition that went the other way around. So he did it in reverse. But you're going to hear all about that in this show. And better than that, once you hear this and you get enthused by the story, you're only about a week away from being able to get your hands on the book and watch the TV series. And all the details of that are going to be in the description of this show, or just go and visit lastoverland.com. We are busy working on Volume 10, Modern Huntsman, right now, and actually it has a book extract and an intro from Alex, who you're just about to hear from, along with a selection of photos from the expedition. But if you haven't got your hands on Volume 9 yet, you can go over to modernhuntsman.com and order that and get it shipped to your door right now. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then this must be the first time that you've listened to the podcast. So head over to that website and you'll be able to read all about the biannual publication, of which I am the conservation editor. It's a spectrum from conservation stories to adventure stories and the sustainable use of natural resources and hunting and fishing and gathering and sustainable farming. All of the goodness that is the kind of world that we want to live in is in the pages of Modern Huntsman. But two more things quickly before we get into the interview. First of all, a thank you to my Patreon supporters. And in the top tier this week, it includes Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman of RD Contracting, James Marchington, the guys at South Esher Stalking, Thomas Cameron, Mark Zabrowski, and Colin Knight. If you would like to support the podcast at any level, head over to patreon.com/Byron Pace, and you can see how you can help support these shows and make sure that I can keep putting them out for free for everybody every 2 weeks. I have also just released, 2 weeks ago, I released the trailer for a film that I've been working on for the last 2.5 to 3 years, Paid in Blood. That is on my YouTube channel. I'd love it if you could go and check it out. Just search Byron Pace Film on YouTube or Paid in Blood, and it should come up. It's about a 2.5 minute trailer, and then I talk for about 2.5 minutes about what I'm trying to do and why I wanted to tell this story. The film is in post-production right now, but we definitely need some help to just get it over the finish line. It's going to be a full feature-length film, but you can learn all about it by going and watching the link, which will also be in the description of the show. And with all of that said, let's welcome Alex Bescoby to the podcast. Alex, welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I'm a little bit upset that we're not doing this, firstly in person, which we had originally planned, but more importantly than that, I feel like this podcast should have been done in a Land Rover.
I completely agree.
Particularly a series Land Rover. And the reason for this is going to become very apparent to the listeners who maybe at this point, unless you've bothered to read the text that I write with every podcast, which I don't think anybody does, will have no idea where this is going. But that would have been fun, or maybe a little noisy and creaky.
Absolutely. Well, having just shot a 4-part series inside a Series 1 Land Rover, I can tell you that the audio is a nightmare.
It must be.
You have to get used to shouting and losing your voice if you want to have any sort of conversation in a 60-plus-year-old car. So definitely good for the visuals, terrible for the audio, I think.
So we're going to talk about this remarkable modern day overland adventure that you did, but I think it's important before, well, just tell people in like a couple of sentences what the journey was that you took, and then we're going to press pause and we're going to explain the background, like foundation to this, because it really goes back a couple of decades.
Absolutely. No, and thank you. Thank you again for having me on to talk about it.
No, it's great. So, like, tell me what was the journey? Just like give people an idea of the route, and then we're gonna go back in time as to where this really started before you were born, I guess.
Yeah, just a few years. Very succinctly, in August 2019, so almost exactly 3 years ago, I decided to drive from Singapore all the way back to London in a 64-year-old Land Rover.
So you're
Crossing,
mad.
yeah, we're having physio, to be honest,
Yeah.
from it. So crossing through, across two continents, 23 countries, and it was roughly 13,000 miles, and it took almost 4 months. So that was
Wow.
the journey.
Okay. Why? Why is the why is the big question here?
I often ask
And this
myself.
is the history. I mean, there's a why personally here, but there's also like a historic why, and this is the reason I asked the question, because in some way you're not the first person to do this.
No, precisely. We were recreating what has been called the greatest road trip of all time, which was the 1955 first Overland. So it was a journey that was completed by six guys back in 1955, so just 10 years after the end of World War II. And they decided, in a world that was sort of opening up, and even though the Cold War was definitely frosting, the world had become a slightly more peaceful place. And they decided to be the first to drive from London to Singapore. No one had ever done it before. People had tried. They got to India fairly regularly, but no one had ever got past what was then Burma, down through Thailand, Malaysia, and to Singapore, which is sort of the furthest you can go on the Eurasian landmass from London.
What was the barrier? Like, why did people fail before? Do you know?
One word, Burma.
Oh, it was that they couldn't get, they weren't allowed through Burma.
Yeah, that's a really interesting part of the story. So I'd been living in Burma or Myanmar as it is now, for almost 10 years when I sort of started coming up with this idea. And the reason I discovered, or one of the reasons I stumbled on this story of the first Overland, was they were the last recorded guys to drive along a stretch of road that went from northeast India into China, called the Stilwell Road. And that road was battered through the jungles of northern Burma by the Americans during World War II. Weirdly, when America and China were allies in the war against Japan, it was a road that was designed to supply the Chinese troops fighting against the Japanese, to get American and Allied arms and weaponry through to them. And so before World War II, no road existed that you could go from India through to Thailand. Just Burma was in the way. And it wasn't until the Americans were sort of, with the necessity of war, decided to just bulldoze this ridiculous road through northern Burma. And I mean, sadly, it kind of was strategically pointless because they never really got to use it. The war ended just as it was finished. But the first Overland took advantage of this road, set off in 55 and drove along it to get into Thailand just before it crumbled away into the jungle for the last time. So
Wow.
that was the window of opportunity that they had, which is why they were able to do it, and no one had been able to do it, before the war or shortly afterwards.
Right. Okay. So how did their journey come about? Because that's
Well,
quite intriguing in itself. And the book, it's called it is sitting in my bookshelf downstairs. It is called The First Overland, isn't it?
it is, yeah, it's an
Yeah.
amazing book. So six guys five guys from Cambridge University. They were all undergrads at that time, and then one guy from Oxford. Talk about expeditions and this idea of doing branded expeditions.
Very stoic and British, isn't it?
Oh yeah, but it's also what I love about it is we think about these ideas of getting sponsors to go and sponsor people doing ridiculous things as some sort of kind of very modern, sort of turn of the century or 21st century thing.
Yeah.
This was absolutely front of mind. They had a crazy idea and they wanted to get brands out there to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought, these guys, that by branding it the Oxford and Cambridge Far Eastern Expedition, it would kind of conjure this romance. And it did, and it worked. And Land Rover were one of the first companies to come in. And then the BBC followed shortly afterwards. And this is one of the best parts of the story. So when they'd managed to get Land Rover and the BBC in, the person they had to convince at the BBC was a young television producer called David Attenborough.
That makes sense as to why he wrote the foreword many years later in the first book.
It's bonkers. There's this lovely picture online.
Wow.
If you just Google David Attenborough, this fresh-faced 20-something producer who essentially opened his door to these 6 young lads who said, "Oh, you want to do something that no one's ever done before." And he said, "Go on then. Well, I'll give you a film reel that'll get you as far as Turkey, and send me whatever you get from Istanbul. And if it looks good, I'll send you some more film reel." And so, with Land Rover backing it, because this was for them a real product test, they just only about
must have been perfect for Land Rover.
Yeah. Well, only 8 years earlier, the thing had been conceived, the Land Rover as a model, and the cars that they took was the Series 1, the very first Land Rover. So for them, it was a way of showing, this cutting edge technology and showing its capabilities. So you had this kind of dream partnership of
cutting edge. It's kind of laughable now, isn't it? But at the time, it really was.
I think and I had to kind of constantly put my head back into that frame of mind, because it's easy to when you get in this thing now, and we can come on to the story of the car, but it is rickety. It's got no power steering, no disc brakes, no central heating, no synchromesh gearbox. All this is very, very basic in our terms car technology. But then it was astounding, and I think 64 years on, we were doing it in the original car. It still worked. A treat.
I mean, I was going to say without breaking down, but let's not spoil that for now. That was a question, not a statement, by the way. And their, in summary, their journey in terms of feat and things that they faced along the way, what was it like for them?
Well, I think the reason it became, I think, such an iconic trip was not just because they completed it in 6 months, with no GPS, no internet, no mobile phones, nothing like that, just sort of paper maps and letters and telegrams if needed.
I love it.
An amazing thing. The fact they did it obviously sort of put them on the, in the history books, but then it was because Tim Slessor, one of the
what a legend,
decided to write this book, which still, it's still in print now. 67 years after it was first written, and it is still a masterclass in great sort of pithy, sort of just stiff upper lip travel writing.
It truly is.
Yeah, and it's a picture of a world, from in 1955, when the British Empire was still in many ways still very present. The Cold War was just settling in. World War II was just receding into the rearview mirror. It was a very, very different world. And, they were able to, you asked me about the route before, they drove right through the Middle East. They went sightseeing in Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. They were sort of tootling through the deserts of Afghanistan, camping, things that we would love to do today, but would be the risk tolerance a little bit higher.
Too high, yeah.
You get this picture of a world that in many ways very different. But, for them, places like China and the whole of Central Asia and large chunks of Eastern Europe, completely off limits.
Yeah. Wow. There's something about, and I know that you and I, and there's a couple of mutual friends we have who share this, this inherent desire as humans, which I think has been somewhat lost in the more modern era, to explore. To see places, and there's maybe something very selfish in that, because you're often just doing it for yourself because it's something that you want to do. But I think we all have that in us still. On a very basic level, it's like you're fishing a river, which I do because I love to fish. And if it's a river I've never been on before, you just want to see round the next bend. Like it's a very small example, and it is that I want to know what I don't know. I want to see the things I haven't seen, and maybe nobody's seen. It's very unlikely these days that nobody's seen it, but there are still places in the world that very few, if any, people have been for a long period of time. So it's exciting. I get very excited about adventure stories, and if you throw a Land Rover in there as well, which I happen to be. I'm probably a little bit more than a fan, which clearly you are too. Then it's like the perfect combination for me, and it harks back to that the Camel Trophy era as well.
Well, I think, I mean, as a sort of, to get a bit poetic, but as a sort of storytelling vehicle, a 64-year-old Land Rover is just perfect.
It is,
because exactly what you just said there about looking around the next corner and just wanting to go to places and see what comes next. You can travel maximum 60 miles an hour in this thing, and wherever you are,
downhill.
You know how cold it is outside, how hot it is outside, how wet it is outside. The elements come through the cracks, and as opposed to driving a modern car, you have to be so present when you're driving a 64-year-old Land Rover, because you can't daydream. You have to be on it.
Oh, you got to be able to drive.
Incredibly present, and you're taking it all in. You can't be sort of listening to the radio. You can't be just daydreaming out the window, listening to a podcast or something. You're in it. And I think the way that people responded to the fact that we were driving this beautiful old car, the car that had done it the first time round. I think if I hadn't mentioned that, that's kind of...
No, we're going to get into that. Yeah.
Yeah, the point of our recreation. The way that people responded to us was, it was half the charm, because a lot of people were just thinking, what the hell are you doing? Driving this kind of rust bucket, through Tibet, or, through Uzbekistan, or, through the sort of the mountains of Nepal. And that meant that everyone you met was instantly sort of warmly disposed. And it gave, for, someone who makes films and writes books, it gives you the most beautiful encounters with people who start off by thinking you're nuts. Yeah. Which is always a kind of safe way to meet people.
It truly is. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
But no, you're right. I mean, about that sort of innate desire to wander and to explore. Absolutely. I mean, the one of the best things about this journey was just the opportunity to indulge that urge, scratch that itch for 4 months, and just as opposed to flying, you just forget how much we miss when we fly.
Oh, huge.
I often do one of those people who stands at the back of airplanes and like looks out of those little windows while everyone else is asleep, and just trying to figure out where I am. And I go, well, look, that's Saudi Arabia. Or, I used to lived in Myanmar for a long time. And I used to fly quite regularly from London to Bangkok or London to Yangon. And, I'd often just think about where I was. And then when I was driving through Central Asia or through China or, through Southeast Asia, I'd look up at the planes thinking, oh, that was me once. And here I am now grappling through the monsoons, or, I stood next to it while it was broken down. It gives you a sense of how big the world is, which I think air travel cheats you of.
Yeah, it does, because it's almost like teleporting. It's very immediate by comparison. And I think you bring up an interesting point about the speed, which is that we live in a very fast world. And everything we do, whether it just be our lives in general, we're always watching the clock. Everything has to be done at a time. You got a Zoom call. You have to be on a podcast call at 1:30. Yeah. And we're watching those seconds continually, because we have so many things, and it makes the day go really fast. And we drive in cars that cruise control at 75 miles an hour along the motorway, and we jump in planes, and we're on fast trains. And you do miss pretty much everything that is going on around you. And we do a lot to distract ourselves from seeing what is going on around us, like listening to podcast, or no, don't stop listening to podcasts, people. But music or whatever it is. And as somebody who also owns an old Land Rover and multiple Land Rovers, I spent a lot of time like listening to the engine and listening to the environment because, surprise, surprise, you kind of have to just in case
Yeah.
something's going wrong. But it puts you in the environment, and it makes it more than just to steal a very old cliche about driving Land Rovers, which is not said with any kind of fondness by people who say it. Is that it's not just a journey, it's normally an adventure because something might go wrong. But
Yeah,
there's something in
great way
that.
to make friends, right? If we're
Yeah.
constantly breaking down. I said I was always astounded about how Oxford, the car we were in, had this amazing capacity to sort of total itself right by a garage, itching. The guys in like Turkmenistan or in Northeast India getting their hands on a Series 1 Land Rover. Actually, to be fair, Turkmenistan was the only country where people weren't happy to see it. I mean,
Why?
they were so baffled by what we were doing. I see in every other country we went to, people were sort of like, I'd say delightfully baffled. They found it funny. They found it interesting. The Turkmen, the Turkmen that we met, they just didn't understand the whole idea. They were saying, so where are you going? Why don't you have a job? Where are your family? Who's paying for this? Those are all really valid questions.
Yeah.
What I don't understand, I literally do not understand the concept of traveling just to travel. I mean, this is
Yeah.
one of the most repressive countries on earth. It lets in fewer tourists than North Korea every year, and it's
Wow.
a strange, absurd dictatorship. But on the sort of on this is what's brilliant about traveling in the way we did. You're just meeting ordinary people rather than having to interact with the government. They were just baffled by the idea of travel for travel's sake. That was the first thing. They were then baffled at why we would choose to do it in a Land Rover. I mean, it's great. It's in the show. There's this great interaction with the mechanics where they're kind of getting angry, saying, because Oxford had a particularly bad breakdown in Turkmenistan, and they said, why didn't you come in a BMW? Or a Toyota?
Or a
I've got
Toyota.
loads of parts for BMWs and Toyotas. This is ridiculous. I've never seen this thing before. And then we had to sort of calm him down and say, look, this thing is so old that you can machine the parts for this. Mm-hmm. And he sort of, got out of his grump and had a look at it. He's like, oh, you're absolutely right. I didn't realize how simple this thing is. Yeah, I mean, I can, I've got an old sort of spin dryer around the back that I can probably take something out of.
Yeah, exactly. You can fix it with a spoon.
I was genuinely annoyed that we hadn't come in a BMW, which I just thought was hilarious. Everywhere else, in Northeast India, particularly like Darjeeling, we had a guy, Land Rovers have obviously a long history in India,
they do.
particularly the tea plantations. And this guy called Gurung, he just was this tiny little hangdog man who he was sort of the greatest Land Rover mechanic in the town. And once he wheeled his car in front, thinking that he would like break into a smile. Nothing, absolutely no expression. He just got in the car and he completely dismantled it, everything, the whole engine. And he cleaned it and he put it back together again in 2 days. And I remember sort of halfway through thinking, what the hell is this guy doing? But
why?
For him,
why did he do this?
It was just, I think for him, it was a once in a kind of lifetime opportunity to dismantle a Series 1, and particularly an iconic Series 1, and then put it back together again.
Wow.
So you do make a lot of friends. And it's, as I said, it just turning up in this kind of clanking, rusty old thing. It really sets people well disposed.
Absolutely. So just to rewind a second, we're getting deep into your journey. How you said you thought about it for a long time. It would be such a cool thing to do. There's lots of adventures that have happened historically that I've thought to myself, I want to freaking do that. Let's do that again. And I haven't done it. So at what point does it become a reality? And how on earth did you find one of the Land Rovers that did the original journey?
I mean, that's the best question, because that's kind of the inciting incident of the whole thing, really. So just to rewind a bit, so when the first Overland finished back in 1956, so they set up in 55, finished 56. They managed to sort of ship and drive their way back to London over another 6 months, and the cars became quite famous by this point, and lots of people wanted to borrow them to go on new expeditions. And somebody borrowed, a guy called Terence Bendixson borrowed Cambridge, the light blue car, and he decided to drive it through the Middle East, and he ended up totaling it into a ditch somewhere on the Turkish-Iranian border. and he was dragged out sort of half conscious with a broken leg. No idea where he crashed it, hospitalized. And since then, Cambridge has vanished into history. No, he sort of he's still alive, Terence, but he sort of roughly knows where it is, but whether it was just, still there or whether it's been hauled for scrap, either way, not the kind of place you want to be digging around in as a Brit on that particular border. So Cambridge vanished, essentially. Oxford got sent on a bird watching expedition with the Royal Ornithological Society to a place called Ascension Island.
Yep, I know it.
Which is one of the most remote it's one of the British overseas territories, still is. Then it stayed there for about 10 years. And no one could be bothered to bring it home. So one of the guys who'd been involved in the bird watching expedition, one of the local support team, he was from St. Helena, which was an island sort of relatively next door. It's near nowhere, frankly. I mean, St. Helena was where they sent Napoleon after Waterloo to hide him so that he couldn't.
I didn't know that.
It's an amazing story. It was sent there because it was British owned, and it had been sort of a coaling station. Oh, sorry, no, I can't remember that. I'm going to get my history mixed up there. It became, but Ascension Island certainly was when this is too early. But when it became quite a strategic, useful piece of rock. But at that point, it was just a piece of rock, and they sent Napoleon there because he had a nasty habit of escaping, and he died there. And his body was shipped back to Paris, but he died on this tiny island. And anyway, this guy called Melvin took Oxford back with him and left it rusting in his back garden, and started cannibalizing it for parts for his other Land Rover that he had, until 2017, when this mad Yorkshireman called Adam Bennett, who loved collecting Land Rovers, and he was obsessed with the first Overland. And people knew where this car was. People had talked about getting it back, but Adam was sort of a particular kind of a particular character, and just decided to get the car back, put it in a box, brought it way back to York, and refurbished it. And it was shortly after that I bumped into Adam at the 70th anniversary of Land Rover. There was a party being held at Red Wolf Bay in Anglesey, really not far from where I am right now. And Adam was there, and that's where I met him. And that's kind of a fateful meeting, really.
Just by chance?
Yeah. I mean, it was weird because I had been reading about the first Overland, because I said I was living in Myanmar at this time. And I said I'd come across them, had this sort of idea of maybe recreating the Stillwell Road drive, going to see if it was still there. And I spoke to Adam, and I said, well, what do you think about me using this for a kind of taking it to Burma and using it? And he said, well, you can use it, but you can only use it if you recreate the entire journey.
Wow. Okay.
And so he kind of called my bluff, and then he said, well, if you're up for it, there's a guy you've got to speak to. And this is sort of the second fateful meeting of it. He said, well, Tim Slessor, the guy who wrote the book and did the journey, he is A, still alive, and B, he's itching to do this journey again.
What?
And he's been trying to recreate this journey for probably like 10 or 15 years.
Jeez. And how old is he at this point in 2017? 87.
So it was kind of, I'd met Adam, we had this car, and it worked. And then I went to meet Tim, and I sort of said, well, I honestly thought I would go around to his house and just sort of get his blessing, and he might come along, for the start or whatever. And he said, no, I'm going to do it with you. And so I again had my sort of my bluff called. I thought, well, I'm a kind of, when you're in a story that's so much bigger than you, and you can't get off the train.
Yeah, and you can't say no to him.
Yeah, no, exactly. The man, I had my doubts, on paper, but when you meet him, extraordinary sort of energy and life in the man, and this sort of sense of, talk about that kind of that exploring instinct. This is a man that he did the first Overland when he was 22 and spent the rest of his life traveling around the world, making films, writing books. The first Overland was just a start. So when I met him, it was these kind of weird meetings where I thought, right, the doors are opening left, right, and centre here. This has to happen now. And so we raised funds and we got sponsors in. And as I said, sort of almost exactly 3 years ago, we were in Singapore with Tim, with the car, at the start line of the Singapore Grand Prix, because why not? And we had 95 Land Rovers behind us from all over Singapore. We closed the roads through central Singapore, and we set off.
That's remarkable. And there's some really beautiful footage of you and
Tim.
yeah, no, so yeah, with Tim. Was that where was that shot? That footage that I would have seen. And he's talking about driving, like how you've really got to drive a car, and this is real driving, and none of this modern rubbish.
Well, he's a brilliant character. So I make films for a living, and when you meet someone like that, you just go, okay, well, I've got a story here.
Yeah,
and he's also, he's a documentary filmmaker. He worked for the BBC for decades. He knows what he's doing as well. So it was a dream to work with this kind of old hand. But that was in York, actually.
Okay, I thought it was here. So was this prior to? So when was that shot?
November 2018.
Okay.
So when we were doing the fundraising, we had to have some, as you know, some sort of proof of concept to kind of tease it.
So lots of people have great ideas, but not that many people can execute them.
Yeah, well, I think that was the thing. On paper, it looked like a good idea, but it also looked dangerous and expensive, right? And that puts people off. So I think my tactic was to just show how amazing Tim as a character was.
Okay.
And I had this instinct that, look, everybody will get this story of, the old adventurer going on his last great mission. It's cross-cultural, it's cross-generational. This man has a dream. It's bonkers, but let's root around him, let's get around him, and let's help him pull it off. And it honestly was, just the ticket. Everybody got that instantly. And that's where it kind of snowballed after filming that stuff in Yorkshire.
Okay. So now you're in Singapore. He's there with you.
Indeed.
Okay.
And then, well, like any good adventure story, there's a plot twist.
Yeah.
So Tim, who, sort of defying all expectations, he'd actually been in intensive care a few weeks earlier with a kind of old health problem. Everything just kept getting thrown at us in the run up to this. But he managed to get on a plane, come to Singapore, come to the start line. He was going to get in the car and just basically go until he couldn't go anymore. And that night, he essentially collapses, and we try and go and find him that morning. We've got thousands of people waiting at the start line, all this press lined up, the cars, sort of 18 months of prep, and Tim is in an ambulance on his way to hospital.
Wow.
So we had sort of prepared a backup just in the case that the 87-year-old might fall at some point during the journey. And Tim and I had this idea that if and when he needed to duck out, which I think people would have understood, that his grandson would take his place.
Okay.
And his grandson, Nat, was the same age as Tim had been. So there's this lovely.
Oh, that's brilliant.
But unlike his grandfather, who by the time Tim went on the expedition, he'd already been in Malaysia fighting as part of his national service. So he was a pretty well-traveled 21-year-old.
Yeah.
But Nat was a sort of typical, 2019 teenager. He just graduated, a bit hungover, hadn't really travelled very much. Had heard his grandpa talking about this forever, a bit dismissive of the whole thing, and we threw him into this, for essentially the gap year of his life. And while we were obviously devastated that Tim ended up going to hospital, he is fine. He came through, which was a massive relief to all of us, and he's still around and still doing fine now. He's 91 this year. The story took this whole new dimension, which was about the grandson reliving his grandfather's adventure from 4 years earlier, while his grandfather got to watch. And again, as a sort of storyteller, filmmaker, I was a bit discombobulated right at the beginning because we built this whole story around him. But then I slowly came to see that this was kind of a genius twist, that actually there was something even more endearing and even more interesting about watching Nat go through this than watching Tim go through it.
Yeah.
And he just turns out to be a fantastic character. He's a chip off the old block. He's just brilliant. And I'm so grateful to him for just trusting us and just throwing in his lot with this, absolutely bonkers endeavor.
And how much did you go through all of the old footage that existed from the original trip?
Well, I mean, we went through. I mean, went through it with a pretty fine tooth comb before we left. So there's about 80 minutes of it that's in color, which is incredible. No sound, so just color soundless. But it is beautiful, and polishing it up. We just literally this week delivering the final episodes to Channel 4, and you'll be amazed at the quality of this footage after all these years. Utterly beautiful. The
Really?
color, the depth. It's just, I mean, we're so lucky because that's what I think sets this story apart from just being a road trip story.
Yeah.
It's a road trip through time because in some places we're quite literally driving on exactly the same road. We had quite a lot of fun recreating photos of Oxford.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. That must have been brilliant.
It was great, and there's some in the book actually. If you in the hardback version, there's in the kind of inside covers, the publishers have put these recreations, and I'm really proud of them. There's one in Darjeeling where Oxford is driving alongside this sort of toy train that was from the 1880s, and you could barely tell it apart. And another one in northern Myanmar where there's during the Thinjan celebrations where there's all these ladies throwing buckets of water at Oxford and recreated that. And one of the most endearing moments where we quite literally went back to a house that Tim had stayed at in 1955, and we called him, and he couldn't believe it because at first we were saying, "Oh, we're in the we're in this tea plantation in Northeast India." He's like, "Oh, no way! The same plantation." He's like, "Yeah, we're actually sat in the living room." Where you stayed. He said, "I can't believe it." And because for various reasons, it barely been touched since the 50s. So, we see photos of the house and then in terms of just reliving history, you could almost feel the ghosts around you. To have Tim's voice on a speaker coming in, it was bizarre.
That's
and
remarkable.
And that for me is what is the real charm of this series, was being able to bring the past to life a bit.
Well, I don't want you to give too much of the story away because the series is when does the series first air?
October the 3rd, so it's going
Okay.
to be on all four. So it's an all four exclusive. So it's going on the streaming first,
Okay.
which is exciting. So you'll be able to actually binge all 4 episodes.
Oh, that's amazing. That's how I like to consume stuff like this.
October the 3rd. I can't wait. I mean, I said first conceived of this, 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago. And in fact, more than 4 years ago. So I think early 2018, where we're getting to late 2022. So about a year of my life has gone into each of these episodes.
That's
I hope people enjoy them.
I feel for you. I totally get it. I'm just getting towards hopefully the end of a 3-year project, so I can some respects relate for sure. A 3-year film project. So I think I'm going to put this podcast out before this goes out, so people won't have to wait long after listening to this conversation. They're like a matter of days to be able to actually go and watch it. And you have a book that is coming out at the same time or after?
Yeah, well, it's actually it's coming out on the 29th, so a few days before, 29th September.
Okay.
You can pre-order it already on Amazon and Waterstones, and it's coming out all good bookshops and Sainsbury's as well, I believe.
Oh, awesome.
W.H. Smith and Waterstones and all that. So yeah, the book for me, because I think I sort of became a filmmaker by accident. I actually would start my first film that I made. I was trying to write a book, and the characters were so beguiling that I thought they'd be wasted in a book that no one would read. So I got a mate of mine to come out and film. It was actually the Burmese royal family. And that became a film called We Were Kings. I'm still really in love with that whole project. And I wanted to be a writer. That was my passion. And I'm so glad now that actually this is the first time I've been able to write a book and get it published. And the series and the book are quite different things, and I think both of them I hope will be enjoyed for different reasons. They certainly tell a very similar story, but obviously when you write, you get to go into things in a way that you can't do in film. And likewise, some things on film that are not in the book, something I'm glad it's got both, to be honest, because I think you get to see different parts of this story. It's a huge amount of fun, first and foremost.
So how many? And I want to glean a couple of extra things out of your journey. Like I said, without giving too much away. But so how many people actually did this with you? So was it one vehicle? Were there support vehicles? What was the logistics after you left? In the wheels are going in Singapore.
Yeah, so the plan was to have two support vehicles. We wanted to keep it small because, for safety reasons, for cost. I mean, we barely raised enough money to do it. In fact, we were still raising money when we left. We were still right till the end. I was essentially building this bridge, and then as we were driving along it was chaos. So it was only small, and everybody was essentially volunteers almost. People were being paid. They were being paid sort of the bare minimum. So we had 8 people and 3 Land Rovers. Obviously, we had the Oxford Land Rover for 55. We had a 2001 Defender 90, and then we had a 2015 Defender 110. And in terms of people, we had myself, my old friend Marcus, Englishman, who's the expedition manager, very old friend of mine from Myanmar. We had Nat, the grandson, also from London. We had 2 filmmakers, Leo from America, Leo from France and David from America. We had a brilliant social media wizard called Tibby from Belgium. And then we had our sort of security manager, a guy called Larry from Singapore. And then finally, probably my favorite character of them all was this guy called the Doc, who was from Indonesia, Dr. Silverius Purba. And
what
he
a great
owned
name.
9 Land Rovers. He's a Land Rover nut, and in his spare time as a doctor. So he came along as both the expedition doctor and the mechanic. I mean, genius.
Well, I mean, what a combination! So he was the human mechanic and the car mechanic.
Yeah, and it just he did a lot more of the car mechanic than the human mechanic, to be fair to him. But in terms of saving money, it was a genius twist. But the idea was, so I said the team came together sort of by accident, partly by accident, partly by design. Half of them were old friends of mine, half of them were people who just got attracted to the story, and all of them were signing up to it not as a job. It was the adventure of a lifetime, and I think it always will be.
And so the journey was planned to take 4 months, was it?
Well, weirdly, when I was in the sales mode, I said 100 days.
Okay, yeah, 100 days, nice round number.
Yeah, it sounded good. It was roughly that. It was roughly possible if nothing went wrong. It ended up taking slightly longer than that because we got stuck in Nepal. Firstly, we didn't realize you actually need to rest. That was something we hadn't really anticipated.
Otherwise, you just burn out.
Yeah, because you're filming and we didn't realize at the beginning what humans were capable of on an overland. But we ended up settling on a kind of a 5-2 pattern where we would literally, travel 5 days, take 2 days off. And you also want to stop and see places. You're in some incredible parts of the world. We got stuck in Nepal because the Chinese closed the border for 2 weeks because they were celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Communist Party.
Well, there's worse places to be stuck. I love Nepal.
Oh, well, I'd never been. And you're absolutely right, because there were places like Malaysia, for example, where we had powered through and barely stopped. And luckily I lived in Myanmar, so I knew Thailand very well. Northeast India, we spent a lot of time in, just because the roads were bad. But Nepal, we were in danger of just rattling through Nepal. But thank God we actually spent, sort of more than a week. I think about a week there, and we took sort of all sorts of detours. Went to Pokhara, went and spent time with the Gurkhas. Spent time in Kathmandu, just kind of recharging.
It's a great city.
Oh, incredible! I mean, as driving goes, definitely the most hair-raising. The drive from Kathmandu to the border with Tibet. I mean, I think the Chinese are sort of known for discouraging cross-border travel. And there'd been a massive earthquake, obviously, in 2015 that flattened Kathmandu. And it also essentially damaged all the roads north of Kathmandu to Tibet. And the Chinese hadn't bothered to really, the Nepalese couldn't afford to, but the Chinese hadn't bothered really to sort of repair the roads. So that drive from Kathmandu north to the Tibetan border, I mean, there's some fantastic photography, but it was kind of Bolivian road of death, sort of looking down at a 2,000-foot drop, with dodgy brakes, and it still makes my stomach turn thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, second tier fun, so not fun at the time, but great in the retelling.
Absolutely. How you drove through Tibet? How was that? Like, how was it getting permission to go in, and how long time did you spend there? What's it like? My experience of Tibet is of the little bit that I know of the history and watching the film 7 Years in Tibet. So
it's a great film.
It is a great film.
Not long ago. You know what? Well, first of all, about how long did it take to get in? Ages. I mean, it was incredibly complicated. So Marcus, who was sort of tasked with doing all the border crossing paperwork, he'd run a travel company in China and Myanmar, so there was no one sort of better qualified. It even aged him, getting 3 foreign cars, 8 people of kind of 5 different nationalities into Tibet at this super sensitive time when the Communist Party was marking 70 years in power. I mean, it was kind of a cluster F of why now sort of thing. Yeah. So there was a certain amount of, are we ever going to get in? So partly I parked it because I thought we might, and that's a whole story about what we would have done if we couldn't get in, because we were a bit screwed if we couldn't get through. The reason we'd gone through Tibet, I should just explain, is that obviously we took a detour from the original route. So they'd gone to Nepal, but they'd arrived at Nepal by coming through India, Pakistan, and through the Middle East. Mm-hmm. But we didn't want to do that because it was too dangerous. So that's why we did this major deviation at Nepal, where we went through China and Central Asia, which I wasn't too upset about because obviously everyone, I think, wants to go to Tibet. So, I mean, getting into Tibet, first of all, I knew the history like you, and I'd watched the films. The roads there are stupendous because the Chinese, as part of their kind of policy of making it, the one China policy, have kind of smothered the place in beautiful tarmac motorways and 4G signal. So we had 4G internet all the way through.
I'm kind of disappointed, to be honest.
It is. It is. Yeah. But you're also the only car on the road for days at a time.
Wow.
So you're driving through what feels like, Mars. Is where, I can try to describe it. It's kind of driving through like the Scottish Highlands, but if your car was the size of a Matchbox car.
Okay. In the middle of COVID when no one else was on the road.
Yeah, but there were still speed cameras. Every 20 miles or so. It was bizarre.
Not that you probably had a problem about the speed cameras with the Series 1.
Well, they would leave. Yeah, to be honest, we were very, very rarely in danger of breaking. We're everywhere. But, they would do things like they would leave these like hulks of cars dressed up as police cars. They would just leave them on the side of the road. And you drive up and think, oh, God, there's a police car. And you realise it was like a crash dummy in an old Hulk. But it was just to slow people down because obviously the temptation was people would just treat this like the Autobahn in Germany because there's no one there, and they'd be doing 150 miles an hour on these beautiful tarmac roads. And you get into Tibet and you stay on the same motorway until you leave out of Kyrgyzstan for 2 weeks. And the most bizarre thing is you enter Tibet near a town called Jurong, and you then drive sort of 2 days over. You drive northeast before you're supposed to be going northwest to the town of Shigatse to tell the Chinese authorities that you've arrived. And you have to get your car you have to get a special Chinese driving license, you have to get special insurance, all these sorts of things. And the worst part about it was that we got there and went through all these tests, and our guide, there were sort of 2 guides who were licensed to do overland trips through Tibet, and we managed to get one of them. He kind of comes out of the police station quite sheepishly and says, everything's fine, one problem, Oxford is 44 years too old. It's actually, you're not allowed to drive a car in Tibet, foreign car in Tibet that's over 20 years old. And by this point, we've been in Tibet for 2 days. We're 600 miles in, and we've got another 2 weeks of driving to go. And so I was like, what are we supposed to do? He's like, just don't hit anything, and you'll be fine.
Oh, okay.
So, you set off, you're already on edge because you're in China, you've got the history. We're heading into Xinjiang, which is even more sinister, in terms of the politics there with, the Uyghur concentration camps. And, but then you're also thinking, if we get stopped at any point, this car is illegal. What we're doing is illegal. So apart from that, the food is not great. It's freezing cold. The altitude buggers you. You
How
can't
high are
breathe.
you there?
Over 4,500 meters.
Jeez.
And then you drive past Everest, which is obviously almost twice as much. We had almost the whole team ended up in some sort of clinic with altitude sickness, at various stages.
Not fun.
Everyone's got the shits.
That was my India experience, just having shit for 3 months.
There's nothing worse than a Tibetan pit latrine. I will go to my grave thinking that. And you know what? Larry, the Singaporean, whose parents are Chinese, and he'd driven through Tibet twice before. And he said to me, he's like, when you're here, you'll be asking, why did I come? It is real hardship. You're freezing cold, you can't breathe, long, long days of driving. He says, but I guarantee you, in a year or so's time, you sat at home thinking, when can I go back? And I did not believe him at the time. But watching the footage when we were editing the series, it is just stupendous. And the Tibetan Plateau is, it's one of the most curious and brilliant sort of, biospheres on Earth. It feeds sort of 4 of the major rivers in Asia. The glaciers there, and sort of a third of humanity kind of gets its. I think I might be getting my statistics wrong there, but gets its water from the glaciers that's melt and come down from there. It's an extraordinary part of the world. Never mind the human history.
Amazing. Well, yeah, I'd love to go there someday, but it's such an as you've very clearly described, it's such an arduous task to be able to get in. You need a very good reason to want to go to all of that effort.
Sorry, one more thing on that. I mean, about the beauty of overlanding is that I spoke to people before and since, and they said, "Oh, did you go to Lhasa?" No, because you fly to Lhasa, or you can get the train to Lhasa. That's if you go into Tibet, you go to Lhasa. That's how you get in as a tourist. So no, I went to Lhasa. Went to this place, Shigatse, sort of one of the second cities, and and then I went to a place called Mount Kailash, which is one of the world's holiest mountains. It's the center of the universe for Buddhists, and it's part of the cosmology of the Hindus, and there's very few people have ever been there, because the only way you can really get there is drive. There's no train network, there's no planes that will take you there. You have to drive. And the beauty of doing this journey is that I have been to places now which are only accessible by a week or so of hard driving. Back in the day, many of these people in parts of Tibet, you'd only be able to get there on a mule, and it was a real lifetime achievement to go to these places. But there are still places on Earth which you can only get to by driving through freezing cold and no air for 2 weeks, and that is Tibet.
Wow. I mean, I know you get this, but I weirdly find that appealing.
As I said, now looking back, I mean, you can see the image of me there, like looking pretty grumpy at some points. I think it was just the Tibetan food is bad. I mean, that sounds really terrible to sort of just besmirch, but it's not. It's not. I would not go back for the food, and you're sort of you're living on that, and it's freezing cold, and you can't really sleep well because there's not enough air. You feel hungover.
Yeah, I know from being high up in Nepal, like every morning. Yeah. Waking up with kind of a headache and feeling a little bit hungover, and it was just the altitude.
Yeah. And I think that was, it just, as I said, but incredible, absolutely incredible.
So the road that you described earlier that was opened up after the Second World War by the Americans, did that exist or doesn't exist, or did you take it, or were you in the area?
Well, sadly, we weren't able to go because, Burma. I said it had been my home for a long time, and knew it very well of the places we were going. It was the places I knew best. And Marcus had also, the expedition manager had also thought if there's any people who could try and wangle our way to find this road, it would be us. The problem with the road is that it was in the far north, in an area that's been essentially fought over since shortly after the Second World War. So you might know, but Myanmar has been sort of riven with ethnic and sort of religious conflict ever since its independence in 1948. And these fights were starting when Tim was driving through in 55. This is when some of these wars kicked off and they're still going. And there's sort of this shifting mosaic of conflict. And the Stillwell Road has always been in the kind of some of the most remote and conflicted parts of north and northwestern Myanmar. And so nobody really knows how much of the road still exists. But we know that in 55, so 10 years after the war, it was already falling apart.
Yeah, so the
So,
likelihood of it being in a state that you
yeah,
could pass is pretty slim, I
yeah,
would guess.
precisely. But what I wanted to do was drive up to it, get as close as we could, have at least a bit of footage of us driving on a bit of it.
Mm.
But we got to Mandalay, sort of real central Myanmar, and my friend Situ, who was guiding us through, just said, "You'd be stupid. There's RPG fights going on up there. They're blowing up bridges. You'd be stupid." So we ended up having to detour into Manipur, whereas they crossed into Assam. We crossed into Manipur and then through Nagaland, which was actually amazing. I mean, as you know, the Nagas sort of famous for being headhunters up until sort of the mid 20th century. And in terms of driving, I'd say actually trumped Nepal for its just sheer rough and ready, gravel roads through mountains, just absolutely incredible. We got ourselves into some serious trouble there, actually, which I will save for the series because
Okay.
episode 2, you'll find out what happened.
Episode 2.
Met the Nagas. Yeah. But no, so we never got the chance to go back and see the Stillwell Road. It's something that I still hope to do one day, although Myanmar has obviously gone even worse since we finished.
While you were doing the journey and it was building and you were going through these countries, and how were you communicating this to the world, and what was the response like? Because you said you had someone there who was sort of dealing with all your social aspects. Because I think that's when I became aware of it, was the feed of information that was coming out while it was happening.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, obviously, what's one of the biggest differences between, then and now is obviously we were able to, communicate and broadcast this journey live as we were doing it. And there's definitely pros and cons to that, right? And I'd say probably more cons than pros. But it did allow, thousands of people around the world to follow this journey. People who knew the story of the first overland. So many people have been inspired by reading the first overland to become overlanders. I was amazed by the letters, emails, messages we got even before we left saying, "We're so glad you're doing this because the first overland, changed my life."
Yeah.
And so there were so many people who got to, who got to follow the journey, who would love to do it. So that was a huge privilege to be able to share it. But it did always, I guess on the con side, it meant that you were never really away. I think that's
You're not like fully
how
detached from the world, which is something I look forward to, is not knowing what's happening in the rest of the world and not having to tell the rest of the world what I'm doing either.
Precisely. And there were moments where, like Turkmenistan, where we genuinely were cut off from the world because the internet didn't work. Or, in certain parts of the world where we genuinely just did lose signal. And I think, like anyone does when they put their phone down, they have the initial irritation of not being able to communicate. And then this kind of serene calm of actually just being able to enjoy whatever it is that you're doing. And, the beautiful thing again about Oxford and about this journey is that you cannot fail but to be present and in the moment. And, it allowed a lot of time for, thought and reflection. And, and then weirdly coming back, just before COVID, I then wrote the book during lockdown, which again gave me a complete different perspective on this kind of globe-trotting journey and how lucky we had been. I was writing the book at a time and we didn't know which direction this was going. We didn't know whether travel would ever return, and in some ways, it's still, China's still closed and it's still impossible really to recreate the journey we did.
Yeah.
But I think we have lost something, I think, in having the ability to just immediately communicate and immediately transmit what we're doing. I think there's still a huge virtue in being able to stop, think, write, and then deliver what it is you'd like to say.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Well, all I can say, Alex, is that it's a remarkable journey and a brilliant story, and I can't wait to see the series when it comes out and read the book. I think that we are definitely missing this sort of unrelenting desire to just make shit happen on this kind of scale, where nothing's perfect, and you just, I don't know, it's these kind of things happened with greater frequency 80 years ago, 50 years ago even. And it just doesn't seem to exist so much in our sort of modern era. And I'm kind of sad for that. So I think it's a beautiful thing that I think you're very similar ages to me, that there are people still doing it and just saying, you know what, we can live this sort of adventurous life still. Like, it's still possible.
It is. Just make sure you do it in 1950s technology.
Well, I'm all for that.
I think maybe that's the answer. I mean, get rid of all these mod cons and modern luxuries, and if you really want to have an adventure, do it like they did in the 50s.
Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. It's been a marvelous conversation, and you being able to just share this insight ahead of everything being released. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you, mate. Cheers.